Hello and welcome to ID Talk, answers from infectious disease experts. I'm Dr. Nathan Price, a pediatric infectious disease specialist at Banner University Medical Center, Tucson, and associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. With Dr. Scott Olson, I am the Arizona AAP Infectious Disease and Immunization Co-Medical Director. This podcast has been created to answer questions from our chapter members about anything and everything infectious disease and immunization related. Thank you for tuning in today. This is the week of February 24th. So let's get to our questions. The first one is, after President Trump signed an executive order to remove the U.S. from the World Health Organization, how will scientists know what strains of disease to use in vaccines, for example, the influenza vaccine? This is a fantastic question, and as I'm sure you've seen, every day leads to something a little bit different, and so it's really hard to know how different policies are going to affect things in the near future and what things are going to change. We know that various groups work together to help determine which influenza strain should go in the next vaccine, and in the past, the U.S. collaborated with the WHO. There are 7 centers worldwide that collect influenza viruses that then analyze them to help determine which strains should be used, and 2 of those centers are here in the United States. There are also many other centers worldwide that contribute data to the WHO in order to help better understand what is going on with influenza virus throughout the world. The WHO uses this information to help determine which strains should go in the vaccines, and they're actually going to be meeting on February 28th to go over this new data. In the U.S., the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee has the final say on what the composition of influenza vaccine is. So it's really unclear how things are going to go moving forward now that the U.S. has withdrawn from the WHO. I'd like to think that there will still be some data sharing, but in a less efficient manner. It is entirely possible that data doesn't get shared to the detriment of everyone. The vaccine makers also should have access to some of this data as well and be able to use it to help determine which strains go into the vaccine. So we'll have to see what happens moving forward. Obviously, things are changing rapidly and more to come. Okay, next question. Have there been any developments in the norovirus vaccine trials? This is another great question. So norovirus is an incredibly contagious virus, in part because it's a virus that's quite hardy and is able to survive on surfaces for many days. And I'm sure you've seen that it goes through groups really quite quickly and efficiently. And so this is the virus that's implicated in outbreaks in daycares and on cruise ships, and has even led to shutting down certain medical facilities because of outbreaks, because they haven't been following infection prevention principles very well. Norovirus has become the most common GI virus, leading to medically attended care since the success of the rotavirus vaccine. And it's estimated that 1 in 15 Americans will develop norovirus infection this year. Fortunately, norovirus is a self-limited disease for most people. Usually it leads to watery diarrhea and vomiting that lasts 24 to 72 hours. But in medically fragile patients, it can be a life-threatening infection. There are 10 genogroups of norovirus, with G1 and G2 being the ones that cause the most common infections in humans. There are several vaccine candidates out there under different phases of development, and they use various methods to try to induce immunity, including development of virus-like particles, mRNA, and adenovirus vectors that are replication incompetent. These all target the major capsid protein of VP1. The data from the early clinical trials shows that these vaccines do induce the development of protective antibody, and they have a relatively low rate of adverse effects. And these clinical trials have included adults and young children. Moderna has an mRNA vaccine candidate that is in phase 3 clinical trials. However, there was a recent news report that the trial was paused briefly by the FDA for evaluation because one of the patients developed Guillain-Barré syndrome. So overall, things look promising, and we'll just have to see how things go with these clinical trials. Okay, let's move on to our last question. What are the latest evidence-based guidelines for diagnosing and managing conjunctivitis? This is another great question, and it's a little bit difficult to answer because there's a wide variety of causes and clinical situations when it comes to conjunctivitis in children. And the literature can be difficult to interpret because there can be overlap between colonizing and pathogenic bacteria when you look at culture data. So conjunctivitis is one of the most common causes of visits to the doctor. In adults, viral infection predominates, but in kids, it seems like bacterial infection is probably more common. And there's no good way to clinically distinguish between bacterial and viral infection. Most bacterial conjunctivitis is self-limiting. It usually improves within about 5 days. And some studies suggest that topical antibiotics may lead to more rapid improvement, but others didn't show any difference in outcomes if antibiotics were not prescribed. And it's also unclear whether or not antibiotics can lead to decreased transmission of infection to others. Of course, there are certain exceptions to needing treatment. For example, neonatal disease is very different than conjunctivitis in a lot of other patients. For example, you have a higher rate of things like HSV or gonorrhea or chlamydia in that age group. And gonococcal infection at any age can be site-threatening and requires antibiotic treatment. And of course, if there's an outbreak, that may change how things are handled. So when we look at which bacteria tend to cause bacterial conjunctivitis, it tends to be typical respiratory and skin flora. So things like H. flu, strep pneumo, staph aureus, and others. But again, just because the bacteria grows on culture, it doesn't mean that that bacteria is causing disease. And that's where it makes things tricky when interpreting the literature. And of course, when we're trying to decide what to do clinically, things can be complicated because schools and daycares will often require topical antibiotics before the child can return. And it's important to note that this goes against the AAP recommendations. The AAP does not recommend a child be excluded from childcare or from school unless that child has systemic symptoms associated with the conjunctivitis. So there was a recent study published in 2023 from a group in Colorado, and it involved 2 centers and over 6,000 encounters. And it included as cases children who had conjunctivitis, and as controls, healthy children, and a separate subgroup of controls of children who had URI symptoms but didn't have any conjunctival involvement. And they found in this study that antibiotics did not shorten the length of symptoms or lead to improved outcomes. They also noted that there was a high rate of bacterial colonization with potential pathogens in healthy controls and in the controls who had URI symptoms, so it made it difficult to interpret the bacterial culture data. They also noted that the presence of purulent discharge was not able to be used to distinguish between bacterial and viral infection. So, long story short, when it comes to conjunctivitis, mild conjunctivitis in children resolves on its own, usually within 5 days, and children without systemic symptoms don't need to be excluded from childcare and from school. There may be a benefit to topical antibiotics, but use of antibiotics can carry the risk of adverse effects and developing antimicrobial resistance. So like many things, the need for antibiotics can be determined on a case-by-case basis. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you again for listening to ID Talk. Arizona AAP members can submit questions for future episodes to id@azaap.org. Arizona AAP would like to acknowledge the generous support of the podcast by the Arizona Department of Health Services through the Title V Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant funding. For more information and resources related to infectious disease and immunizations in Arizona, or to become a member, please visit azaap.org. Thank you for all that you do. We'll see you next time at the next ID Talk podcast.